Hi, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the first video in the Floral Frames Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. Throughout this video series, we're going to be working through a panel as I share some of my favorite designs and techniques for quilting the borders of our quilts. In this very first video, we're going to see that quilting motifs can be an easier option than quilting a design that wraps all the way around. I'm going to demonstrate where you can place your motifs, some different options for those designs, and demonstrate how to quilt them on a long arm and a sewing machine. So, let's get to it. When machine quilting the borders of my quilt, the one thing I struggle with is getting the design to wrap all the way around. Connecting that design so that it looks continuous, no matter what kind of machine you're working on, can be tricky. So in this video, we're just going to throw that whole concept away, and I'm going to show you one of my favorite tricks for quilting borders. It looks custom, but it's actually pretty easy. So instead of stressing out about getting that design to wrap all the way around, sometimes I prefer quilting motifs in those borders. Now, motif sounds like a fancy name, but it's just a standalone, separate design that's not continuous. I can put those motifs in certain areas to give it an elegant wow factor, and then just fill in the space between them with a filler. Now, when it comes to adding motifs to your border, you can decide how many motifs, where you want to add them, what kind. I mean, it really is a choose your own quilting adventure. So on our panel, I'm going to be working within this blue area. This is going to be the border that we're going to be filling in. One of my favorite places to put these motifs is in the center of the border, and I also love to put them in the corners, and that's what we're going to do here. You could mark out all of those motifs before you start. You could wing it as you go. It's totally up to you. But I'm going to go ahead and mark out those sections so we can kind of see what I'm going to do when I get to the quilting. Since there really is no wrong or right place to put them, you can use the quilt as your guide. The reason I like to put it in the center is it just kind of fills in those longer borders. It just kind of adds a nice little look, helps break it up a bit. And I could, of course, measure my border and find the center, or I can use some kind of element on the piecing as a guide, and so that's what I'm going to do here. So looking at the center here, just kind of plotting out that that's my center line, I can then decide what kind of motif I want to quilt and what shape of area I want to fill in. Now, I know for us, we're going to be starting with a dot-to-dot geometric motif, and I'm going to fill it within a triangle. So I'm going to take a second and just mark out the outside of that triangle. That's just going to give me a registration point to fill in. And so within this motif is where we're going to start quilting our dot-to-dot quilting motif. And then I can put something swirly around it. Now in the border corners, I can do the same. I can either pretend that I have a triangle in that corner, or I can pretend I have a square and fill it in with the motif of our choice. I'm going to go ahead and do the triangle like we talked about. So just lining up my reference line, marking out my area to fill in. I can then fill in that with my motif, my geometric kind of shape, and then switch that filler in between them. Now, the one most important thing, in my opinion, to quilting border motifs is making them look symmetrical. So if I'm going to put a motif in the center of my border here, I'm going to do the same on all four sides. Now, that's just my opinion, of course, but I think the symmetry is what makes it look nice. All right, now that we have a game plan and an area to fill in, let's pull out the sewing machine and get to quilting. Once I'm ready to start quilting my motif on my borders, I have a couple options. I could either start at that inner border corner and go right into quilting my motif. But what I'm going to do is start from the outer edge of my border, quilt along that marked line until I get to the inner corner. From that point, I can start quilting that dot-to-dot design to fill in that section. To create this design, we're basically quilting wedges that all come back to that inner border corner. So starting from the inner corner, I'm going to quilt a line that goes out towards the outer corner, stopping about a ½ inch or so away from the edge. The reason I'm stopping a ½ inch away from the edge is, in this instance, this is the outer border of my quilt. And in theory, I'm probably going to bind this quilt possibly at some future point. And what I don't want to have happen is I don't want to cut off my motif. So I go ahead and pick a ½ inch because it gives me a little bit of wiggle room in case I need to square up my quilt. Now, once I'm to that point, I'm going to echo the side of my border a couple inches or so, and then return to the starting point, that inner border corner. And there I have my first beautiful wedge. I'm going to keep quilting those wedges, keeping them close to each other and filling in that space as much as possible. So my next line is going to swing out, stopping about a ½ inch away from the previous one. Then I'm going to echo the side of the border and return back to that inner border corner. And I'm going to repeat quilting wedges until I fill in half of that triangle. Now, depending on the size or the width of your border, you can add more or less of these wedges. Really just depends on how dense you want that quilting. One thing I like to do is to quilt half of my area first with those wedges and then do the same on the other side. So since I filled in half this border corner with 3 different wedges, I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Now I also have to remember though that marked line is there, so I don't want my quilting to run into it because I'm eventually gonna quilt my way back out using that line. Now I'm using a ruler because I prefer machine quilting with it, but you don't have to use a ruler to get a great quilting design. And once I've quilted my wedges in that area, I can quilt along that second marked line to get out to the edge. Once I have that motif finished, then I can fill in the space with a filler design of my choice. It really doesn't matter which design you use, but I would suggest picking one that you're comfortable with, that you like to quilt, because you're going to be filling in the rest of our border with that design. Now for the next section that we marked out for our border motifs, I'm going to do something a little bit different, a little florally, feathery motif. And of course, like I said before, it's totally up to you whether you want to quilt along those marked lines or just use them as a reference. I'm going to go ahead and quilt along them because I like to go ahead and define that area and then fill it in when at all possible. And then I'm going to travel along the edge of my border until I'm halfway along that section or underneath my point. Now from here, I'm going to quilt a feather motif. So starting from that point, I'm going to quilt an oval that comes out to a point and back, and that's going to be the center of my motif. And then if I want, I can add a little bit of embellishment on the inside, an echo line, a little swirl, whatever I feel like doing. Then I'm going to build off that centerpiece by adding feathers that build off to each side. This is a great way to practice quilting feather petals without committing to a large all-over feather design. It's a great way because it's nice and small and compact. Gives you a little bit of tiptoe into the feather quilting. So from here, I'm going to quilt a line that curves out and then stops once I touch the center part of my motif, until I have my first little petal right there. Now to quilt the next one, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, not tricky, but just a thing to think about. I'm going to travel along that previously quilted part of my petal and then swoop out and quilt the next one. So one of my petals is going out and the next one is coming back. But the good news is this is the last one, so I'm almost done with half of my motif. So traveling along and then quilting that next petal. And I'm going to bring that line all the way back to that center point because I need to do the same on the opposite side. Again, quilting my petal that goes out and stops when I'm touching that center part, traveling back around it, and then adding my next one. And then once I'm finished with that side, I can continue traveling along the edge of my border until I get to the opposite side. I can then go into quilting the filler that I'm going to do in the rest of the border. But you can also use it as a jumping off point to add a little bit more, detail to it, or a little bit more to the motif. So an optional design idea would be to take this section and then echo it a couple times. It's going to help separate it from the filler, help it stand out a little bit more, and just make it look really nice. So I'm going to echo that line, travel along the edge, and echo it another couple times. And then just for fun, I'm going to quilt one of my echo lines so that's a couple inches away from the previous one. What that's going to create is a defined space that I can then fill in with a different design. But in this section, I might go ahead and quilt a wishbone or any other design I think that would look great. Now, if you haven't quilted wishbones yet, don't worry. We're going to be seeing this again in a future video. Just know that you can fill in this area with a filler design. You can fill it in with back and forth lines, whatever design you feel comfortable quilting. And then once that area is filled in, I can continue echoing. I could add more of those sections, or I can just say, you know what, I'm done with this, and continue quilting my filler design. But remember, since I like to keep the quilting symmetrical on all sides, I know that whatever I do here, I'm going to have to do in all the other borders. Now I'm using this gold thread because I know it's going to show up on the camera and you'll be able to see what I'm doing. However, if you purchase the coordinating thread collection that I put together for the custom panel, you can use that dark blue thread in this area. It's still going to give you a beautiful texture, let you see the quilting without such harsh contrast in color. And once I have that motif finished, I've decided, you know what, that's enough of that. I can go back to filling in the rest of the area with that filler design. And what I love about it is even though quilting a feather motif might not be your idea of an easy option, it's a whole lot easier than quilting a feather that wraps all the way around the border. But I still get that curvy, elegant look. Well, now that we've seen how to quilt this on a sewing machine, let's see a couple different options on the long arm. There's not a whole lot of difference quilting border motifs on a long arm as opposed to a sewing machine. I'm still going to mark out my sections and fill them in with my motifs. The main difference is that I always use a ruler when quilting diagonal lines on my long arm. But besides that, the motifs still go together the same way. So for the feather motif, I'm going to still quilt my center part, add the petals, and then move on. Although I will say that my motifs tend to be a little bit bigger on a long arm as opposed to on a sewing machine, since I have a little bit more space, but whether big or small, the motifs still look great. And just as we saw on the sewing machine, after quilting the motif, you can embellish it with more echo lines and filler designs. I'm using the wishbone design again, but of course you can use any filler that you prefer. And whatever I do on one side of the motif, I'm going to make sure I do on the other. Then, once I'm happy with it, I'm going to fill in the rest of the border with an all-over design, such as swirls, or really any filler would work. Now for a slightly different dot-to-dot motif, I can quilt the center wedge so that it's centered on the border corner. Instead of making my first line go directly to the corner, I can quilt it so that it's an inch or so below, echo the sides, and then return back to that inner border corner. After that, I'm going to quilt the wedges in the remaining area just like we did earlier. Since this isn't the outermost border, I'm only leaving about a 1/4 inch gap in between the wedges and the edge of the border. And you know I like to keep my design symmetrical, so I'm going to quilt the same number of wedges on both sides. Once the motif is finished, I can quilt a few echo lines and then go into quilting that filler design. And the dot-to-dot motif can go in square-shaped areas as well. Just define the area, fill in with wedges, and then move on to the filler. The result is a smaller motif that's great for those smaller borders. Once you get comfortable quilting motifs, you could experiment with different variations. There's just so many different ways you can use them on your quilts. And when you're finished, you have some beautiful motifs that add a little bit of a custom look to your borders, but are much easier than quilting a design that wraps all the way around. All right, now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge, go ahead and fill in that outer border highlighted in red with the motifs of your choice. You can use the designs I showed you in this video, or you can come up with your own variations. I've also put together a free quilting diagram and tip sheet that you can download, print it off, and keep next to you while you're quilting for extra tips and hints. Or if you're needing a little bit more help with your quilting motifs, you can get the expanded resource PDF with even more tips and even more diagrams and pictures and options for quilting the borders with motifs. To get either one of those or to find out more information about the other videos in this series, all you have to do is click the link in the description box or scan the QR code. I'll be back soon with the second video in this series. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.